Hello, my name is Ryan Powell, and I'm a professor of cinema and media studies at the Media School here at Indiana University. Welcome to IU Cinema's screening of Derek Jarman's 1978 film Jubilee, part of the Forever Queer film series. I just want to offer a little bit of historical context to do with the film, and then a couple of questions, some things to think about kind of going into the film as part of this series. So I'll start with just a bit of context about Britain at the time of this film's making. To be young and subculturally affiliated in the mid to late 1970s in England meant to live with a number of paradoxes. For instance, mass unemployment meant the anxiety that comes with an uncertain future, but this also meant, for some anyway, a certain freedom from a future that had been mapped out for you. Similarly, the decentralization and decline of city centers, which left numerous buildings and even whole streets abandoned, also meant an increase in spaces open to occupation by misfits of many stripes and a growing constellation of new social activities that began to take root, from squatting in houses to art making and social gathering in post-industrial spaces like empty factories and storage warehouses, all of which proved to be very important locations and sites in the film you'll see tonight. One way of thinking about the parts of metropolitan Britain in which subcultural scenes such as punk, goth, new wave, and others were gaining grounds is as a cultural geography made up of a collection of city spaces that shared in common two contrasting elements: the bleak emptiness of depopulated space, coupled with the frenzied energies of the youth-driven scenes now coming to coalesce through the use of these spaces. It is in this context that Jarman and his co-conspirators created Jubilee, a guerrilla film made collectively across London without permits by a motley crew of non-actors, professional actors, musicians, artists, and film industry professionals committed to the experience of independent work. Cinema itself played an interesting role in this moment of significant change. Repertory theaters such as the Gate 2 Cinema in Notting Hill, where Jubilee had its eventful release on February 3rd, 1978, had spread in a rhizomatic fashion throughout the city, leaving numerous turn-of-the-century theaters repurposed as sites of countercultural world-making. And it's important to note that several of the generation of these cinemas are still operating in this way. The Gate 2, where the film opened, is still showing affordable repertory cinema and has event screenings, as well as cinemas like the Prince Charles in Leicester Square. They're both going strong and kind of have these sort of scenes of independent cinema around them. In fact, in some ways might be interesting to kind of question why this kind of persistence has been possible in London and less possible in other kinds of places. But anyhow, these cinemas rapidly were becoming sites of scene making, where filmmakers invested in sex and gender dissidence. Filmmakers like Derek Jarman, Andy Milligan, and Ron Peck were not just cutting their teeth, but were undertaking thoroughly calibrated world-making projects at both levels of production and exhibition. To put it another way, from filmmaking to film screening, all of Jarman's work indexes not so much a cinema movement, but a collection of nights and days lived, performed, and shared amongst people who, though perhaps recent strangers to one another, as was often the case, were continually coming to define new forms of sensibility and sociability. Jubilee is one of those wonderful examples of cinema where the film and the audience were largely interchangeable. Then new bands and performers who star in the film, including people such as Susie and the Banshees, the Slits, and Adam Ant, also comprised the crowd at the Gate 2 premiere and party for the film, many having purportedly left before the film even finished screening. It's worth noting that boredom was perhaps the signature style for many subculturalists in mid to late 70s Britain. The film is presented here tonight as part of a series of screenings, event talks, and indeed parties, the full title of which is Forever Queer: Community, Memory, and Survival. With this in mind, I want to offer just a few comments that press on questions of social formation and memory as they relate to Jubilee. Like arguably all of Jarman's work, this is a work that balances a mythic sense of history. History is presented here as something deep and magical, as it often is in Jarman's films. With a present day, it's kind of contrasted with the present day in which the possibilities of this kind of history appear at once, ironically foreclosed, but also taken up, albeit in a rather performative fashion. This is perhaps nowhere more sharply elaborated than in the title of the film itself, which simply names the dystopian portrayal of street life that we have here, with the same name used to commemoratively mark the nationwide street celebrations held in the name of Queen Elizabeth's 25 years on the throne, celebrations that took place in the same year as the film's making. There are many interesting questions this provokes. Does the film advocate replacing official history with acts of radical culture making that seek to rewrite this history? Or is this perhaps less about a rewriting and more about a disregarding? Likewise, does the film, in all of its nihilistic zeal, offer a break from the destructive nature of empire in the sense of a refusal or shattering? Or is the film perhaps an occasion for a slighter notion of a break, as in merely coming up with something to do for a bit, perhaps a shared passing of time during the ceaselessness of bad times? Running with this last notion for a second, I wonder what this film might have to say to processes of queer collective remembrance today. Does the film's more than distaste of national acts of memorialization and commemoration extend to any and all attempts to locate cultural meaning through history-making projects? Complicating this in important ways is the fact that at the time the film was made, many of the cultural figurations that have since been characterized as kind of being a document of did not necessarily exist as such. So perhaps most importantly in this regard, the film's participants by and large did not identify or did not squarely identify as part of a social group of punks or queers. That would come later and in many ways be mapped onto this film. And one of the most interesting things about this film is in the kind of coalescence of people that happen within the context of Jarman's work. Many of these bands, many of these participants were just gathering for the first time. It's very new scenes that were being made. It's now regularly ascribed the status of a punk classic or a queer classic, but it's interesting to think about the ways those terms don't quite describe the kind of in-process social formations that we're looking at that wouldn't and couldn't have characterize themselves that way. It's interesting to wonder what a film that revels so deeply in what scholar Earl Jackson Jr. has called negative affirmation might have to say about practices of queer recollection, especially those that characteristically rely on not knowing yourself all that well and maybe not needing to, maybe being very uncertain about the role of the past in constituting the present on both individual and collective levels. As the character Angel in the film played by Ian Charleson announces during a moment of nihilistic reminiscence, he says, "I didn't know I was dead until I was 15. Thinking of this as a possible starting point for the film's queer logic of remembrance, I'm just going to kind of leave this thought there for you to take into the film. It's interesting to wonder what overall, if anything, this film might have to say about forms of looking back that resist celebration of what came before. Jubilee will be preceded by 3 short films from emerging queer filmmakers. Lorraine Was on the News by Doran Max Hagay, 1 Year of Hadija and Pauline by Lee Mananzala, and Dominant Species by Joseph Sackett. These 3 films are examples of the impact and legacy of early queer filmmakers like Jarman and embrace a range of identities, themes, and genres representative of the broad array of contemporary queer film. Please enjoy the screening.